The 1958 World Cup transitioned the sport from a series of local, often brutal exhibitions into a standardized global system. Before this, international competition was defined by structural volatility. The 1954 tournament featured the Battle of Bern, where Brazil and Hungary's players fought in the locker rooms. Recent studies from the University of Leipzig have also pointed to systemic doping in 1954, suggesting the winning German team used Pervitin, a wartime methamphetamine, under the guise of vitamin C. This is the Råsunda Stadium in Solna. Unlike much of post-war Europe, Sweden's infrastructure remained entirely intact, providing a modernized, stable environment for an event that was outgrowing traditional stadiums. This data compares the 1954 and 1958 tournaments. Notice the drop in the goals per match average from a record 5.38 down to 3.60. This was the first measurable sign of defensive organization and tactical maturity taking hold of the game. By the end of the month, the experimental era of the sport had been replaced by the technical and organizational foundation of the modern game. This diagram deconstructs the top star ball. By increasing the panel count from 18 to 24, the design improved the ball's sphericity and flight consistency. Along with the adoption of screw-in studs for the wet Scandinavian turf, the game became faster and more predictable. While these tools changed the physics on the pitch, the culture of the game was being altered by a different technology: live multinational television. This archival image shows a group watching a match on a single set. For the first time, 8 European nations received a simultaneous live broadcast, exposing millions to a new visual language of the sport. This visibility created a logistical problem. Viewers on low-resolution black-and-white sets couldn't identify individual players. FIFA's solution was to mandate fixed uniform numbers for the entire tournament. This standardization turned athletes into visually identifiable figures, laying the groundwork for the modern athlete as a global icon. There is a common perception that Brazil's performance in 1958 was a triumph of unstructured, spontaneous street football. However, the evidence suggests a much more calculated approach. Brazil arrived in Sweden with an interdisciplinary sports science delegation that was ahead of its time, including doctors, physiotherapists, and dentists. Their medical staff performed systematic dental work on the players, operating on the theory that treating minor infections would prevent the systemic muscular degradation during a high-intensity tournament. The team also employed Dr. João Carvalhais, a psychologist who utilized psychometric testing to evaluate the emotional stability and intelligence of the squad. In his official reports, Carvalhais warned against playing the 17-year-old Pelé, whom he labeled infantile, and Garrincha, whom he deemed unfit for high-level play. Coach Vicente Feola reviewed the data, but ultimately chose to trust his footballing intuition over the scientific recommendations. Brazil's dominance was built on this scientific scaffolding. It provided the structural safety required for unpredictable individual talent to be effective. Tactically, 1958 served as the graveyard for the WM formation, which had been the standard for global football since the 1930s. This top-down look at the WM formation shows its core mechanic: strict man-to-man marking. Brazil introduced a fluid alternative, the 4-2-4. It replaced fixed marking with mathematical space coverage. Fullbacks pushed up the flanks, overloading wide areas and forcing defenses to abandon assignments.
This is Didi, the metronome of the team. He used his passing range to dictate the tempo, allowing the forwards to focus entirely on their movement without ever having to drop back into the midfield. The spatial coverage provided by the 4-2-4 moved the game away from individual man-marking toward a modern system of zonal defense. While Brazil focused on systemic balance, France utilized a hyper-offensive model orchestrated by the technical skill of Raymond Kopa. This chart tracks the performance of Just Fontaine. He scored 13 goals across only 6 matches, a frequency that remains an outlier in the historical data. The context makes the data more unusual. Fontaine was not France's first-choice striker, and he ruined his only pair of boots in training before the tournament started. Because of a lack of spare equipment, Fontaine played the entire tournament and set the record, wearing boots borrowed from substitute Stéphane Brouilly. The highlight of this run was a 4-goal performance against West Germany, the defending world champions, in the third-place match. Fontaine's 13-goal record stands as an artifact of a transition era, caught between extreme offensive firepower and the arrival of more organized defensive structures. Following a 0-0 draw with England, Brazil's offensive momentum had stalled, and their tactical superiority was being questioned. This is Lev Yashin, the Soviet goalkeeper. To beat him, Brazil introduced 2 variables their psychological tests had labeled as risks: Pele and Garrincha. The opening 3 minutes are described as the most one-sided start in history, with Garrincha repeatedly bypassing the Soviet defensive line. Garrincha utilized his physical anatomy, specifically his bowed legs, to create deceptive, biomechanically unreadable movements. He moved in directions that standard defensive coaching couldn't anticipate. The statistical impact was immediate. Brazil never lost an international match when Pelé and Garrincha were on the pitch together. This was the exact moment the 4-2-4 system achieved its full potential, providing a stable platform for unmarkable individual movement. During the knockout stage, 17-year-old Pelé set the technical and biological benchmarks for the modern forward. This map shows the penalty area against Wales. Pelé receives the ball back to goal, surrounded by a dense defensive block. He solves this with a specific physical sequence: a tight flick over the defender, an axial rotation, and a finishing volley. In the semi-final against France, he followed this with a hat trick scored within a 23-minute window. Pelé systematically targeted the spatial voids left by the injury of French defender Robert Jonquet, demonstrating an advanced understanding of the pitch. The final match took place at the Råsunda Stadium in Solna against the host nation, Sweden. Pelé's first goal of the final involved a chest control, an audacious sombrero flick over defender Bengt Gustafsson, and a finishing volley. Pelé closed the match with a 90th-minute header to secure a 5-2 victory, making Brazil the first nation to win a title across continents. The legacy of 1958 rests on 3 pillars: the arrival of the global television audience, the integration of sports science into tactical planning, and the emergence of the identifiable superstar. By the final whistle, the sport had its modern blueprint. 1958 provided the organizational and tactical foundation that defined the next 60 years of global football.